Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, in our ongoing study in Hans Kuhn and on Being a Christian, published in 1976. We're going to take a look at pages 35 to 45 on positing real Christian substance. So let's begin with block 1. We begin by negating authoritarian ecclesiology. Turning to modern man was long overdue for the church, but it couldn't simply restore the past. The church should not and cannot fall back on being authoritarian, says Kuhn. It must take up a socio-critical theology. It cannot simply exist as the bulwark of the existing order. So the church must affirm socio-critical theology. It must be open to dialogue within the community. And he said the theology produced by Vatican II is not final. It is still in need of additional refinement. The church must continue to be self-critical of its own positions, self-critical of dogmatism, self-critical of biblicism. But, here's his qualification, without sacrificing the real Christian substance. Therefore, negating authoritarianism and affirming dialogue should bring about the positing of real Christian substance and real Christian hope. Damnation of the world and glorification of the world are both wrong theological positions. Each extreme is wrong. We need common sense without illusions, says Kuhn. Theologians must not become ideologists that simply posit a system of ideas based on particular interests. That must be avoided. Therefore, in Block 2, we take a look at the failure of our super-technological society. The upheaval of our lifetime is the second great break in history, the first being the invention of the agricultural age, when we transition from barbarism to civilization. Now, the super-industrial culture emerges on the horizon, but everything is wrong in this quantitative process. Not being at ease, that's the term he uses. Not being at ease has become universal feeling and universal conviction by humanity. So the negation of not being at ease and the super-technological culture science and technology are not the key to man's happiness. We are disturbed by the contradictions of international economics. There's an increasing gap between rich and poor nations, and there's a lack of stability in Western democracy. So, this affirmation of technological culture and this feeling of not being at ease results in a lack of solidarity in human existence. There's an ambivalent character to progress itself, says Kuhn. We develop and we will destroy humanity if this trend remains unchecked. We're caught in a cycle of production, consumption, and wastage. The vicious cycle of production, consumption, and wastage. We're facing shortage of raw materials, overpopulation, food scarcity, and environmental pollution, and possibly the extinction of humanity by 2100. This catastrophe is actually a possibility. So Kuhn gives us a very definite and very desperate situation. He outlines a situation where we've been caught up in a vicious cycle of production, consumption, and wastage, and that vicious cycle is heading humanity toward self-destruction. And he says that has also brought about a further consequence, and that is in Block 3. Religion has been replaced by capitalism. We have suppressed religion. We have replaced religion. We've gone from dominion to destruction. Mankind has been enslaved to the pressure to consume. Man has plunged into greater tragedy. Dominion has become destruction of nature. And also, and this is key, there has been an impoverishment of language. Language has become impoverished. And rationality has only reaped a lack of meaning, a lack of centeredness. Language and the lack of meaning. Politico-social revolution has not led to true humanity. We must negate any inhuman conditions. Commodity value cannot be the supreme value. It's motivated by self-interest, and capitalism replaces religion. He concludes by saying that the objective destruction of nature and the subjective loss of meaning has resulted in a replacement of religion by capitalism, by that vicious circle of production, consumption, and wastage. There must be an end to man's exploitation. We must find practical proof for every theoretical system. There are structural injustices in the capitalist economic system. The theory of historical materialism rests on false presuppositions, says Kuhn. So he gives us very specific and very pessimistic conclusions concerning our present situation. Our present situation is desperate because there's a need to posit real Christian substance, to lift up that Christian reality, the reality of kingdom that is behind sensate reality that has been hidden and suppressed. There's a need to posit real Christian substance, real Christian identity. And that means that we don't simply posit an authoritarian institution. The church is not to posit authoritarianism. Instead, it's supposed to be open to dialogue, he says, and through dialogue, we will write a correct theological position without illusions, without it becoming an ideology controlled by very particular interests. In other words, we have to have a theology that is more universal in nature. And at the time of this writing, around 1976, I can think of the universal theology of political theology being expressed by Jürgen Moltmann's book, The Crucified God. His book was universal in scope. However, after the writing of Jürgen Moltmann's book and after its publication, liberation theology did emerge, and it emerged in a fragmented plurality of particular interests. You had black liberation theology, you had Latin American liberation theology, you had feminist liberation theology. Multitudes, a pluralistic breakdown evolved, but they all were abbreviated under the universal political theology of Jürgen Moltmann, a colleague of Hans Kuhn. So in Block 1, I think the position that Kuhn is taking is that particularist ideologies must give way to the need for positing universal Christian substance that is not driven by particular interest. Now, in addition to that need, there's the current problem in Block 2. And the current problem is very specifically a technological society of lightning-fast communication, international internet communication, a super technological society that is nested within a commodity-based type of community, a consumerism, a vicious cycle of production, consumption, and wastage. And the key point in Block 2 is this loss of language, the loss of language. What he tells us in Block 2 is that we're caught in this vicious cycle of production, consumption, and wastage, and that has resulted in Block 3, Note 1D, the impoverishment of language. We don't have a centeredness in Christ. We don't have a centeredness in deep meaning. We've lost that to that consumerism type vicious circle. So our language is not a language of depth. It's impoverished. It is weak. We've lost a language of the signs that matter for existence, a language that should be made up of the signs and that make up meaning. We suffer a lack of meaning. And that's what he emphasizes in Block 3. The consequences of a need for a universal positing of Christian substance, and the consequence of a super technological society and the vicious circle of production, consumption, and wastage has resulted in Block 3 in a trajectory toward destruction. And he says basically it's a destruction of nature, it's an impoverishment of language, and this reliance on rationality is a rationality without depth of meaning, a rationality without a depth of significance or centeredness. And that becomes the key issue in Block 3, the lack of meaning. Language and the lack of meaning within our language. The lack of significant language. And the lack of any real desire to seek out the signs of kingdom. So it's a very pessimistic conclusion. It's a very pessimistic 10 pages from 35 to 45. But I think Kuhn draws an accurate picture here that the world is ethically upside down. Worse than that, it is a fragmented world. And the fragmented pieces have been caught up in a false ideology of production, consumption, and wastage. And so he perceives the world as lost in a lack of meaning, lost in a lack of centeredness, and an impoverished language. And that is absolutely the point that he's making here. The key point in this lesson is the need for Christian substance to be posited, and the failure of technological society has resulted in impoverishment of language, impoverishment of meaning. So it is a pessimistic lesson, but it's the evaluation of where we are, and these are Kuhn's conclusions. That is going to wrap up page 35 to 45, and we will conclude part 1 in the next lesson. That'll take us from 45 to 55, and that will wrap up part 1.